it's rather long, so I think you all can just keep your seats. There was a man who was very rich named Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. The woman was clever and beautiful, but the man was surly and mean. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men and said, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. Thus you shall salute him. Peace be to you. Your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm. Therefore let my young man find favor in your sight, for we have come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." But Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Shall I take my bread and my water and the meat that I have butchered for my shears and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" So David's young men returned and told him all this. David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he shouted insults at them. Now therefore consider what you should do. For evil has been decided against our master and against all his house, and he is so ill-natured, no one can speak to him." Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep ready dressed, 5 measures of parched grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. She loaded them on donkeys and said to her young men, "Go on ahead of me, I am coming after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and alighted from the donkey. Bowing to the ground, she said, "Upon me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Do not take seriously this ill-natured fellow Nabal. Now let this present that your servant has brought be given to your young men. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. When God has appointed you prince over Israel, you shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause." David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the God of Israel who sent you to me today. Blessed be your good sense, and blessed be you who have kept me today from blood guilt and from avenging myself by my own hand. Unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there would not have been left to Nabal so much as one nail." Then David received from her hand what she had brought him. He said to her, "Go up to your house in peace. See, I have heeded your voice and granted your petition." Nabal was holding a feast in his house, and he was very drunk. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of him, Abigail told him these things, and his heart died within him. He became like a stone. Then David sent and wooed Abigail, and she became his wife. Some of you will remember our annual sheep shearing day at Swan Mountain Farm, especially Jody, who was the loyal assistant to Marc Seiler, the chief sheep shearer. Marc always started with the rams because, he explained, they come with handles. Marc grabbed Charlie by the horns and wrestled him over on his side. Charlie, like all the sheep, began that morning as a massively wide ball of fluff, his wool discolored a dingy brown by dirt. By the time the clipping was done, he was a skinny thing, and the thin layer of wool left on him was shockingly white. As soon as he could get his feet under him, Charlie escaped into the pasture. Marc then repeated the process with Chip. And when he ran into the pasture, the two rams, not recognizing each other with their new haircuts, aimed their horns, charged at each other, and butted heads repeatedly. This may have something to do with why Jesus often used sheep as an example of clueless stupidity. Suspicion of anything different or unfamiliar seems to be the default response in sheep, and in humans too, I'm afraid. In today's scripture, the response of Nabal to David's request for food is rather typical. Who is David? Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat and give it to men who come from I do not know where? David's reaction to the insult is unfortunately also typical. Every man strap on his sword. This call to arms has echoed in some form since the beginning of human history. Every man grab his spear, pick up his rifle, aim his grenade launcher, strap on his suicide bomb. Or, most recently, the infamous, "Watch out, Rocket Man, we're going to totally destroy North Korea." The scripture tells us that every one of the men strapped on his weapon, and that, quote, about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. Clearly, these were men with a lot of baggage. So our story is hurtling pell-mell toward a bloodbath. Abigail, described as the clever and beautiful wife of the surly and mean Nabal, takes matters into her own hands. Now, this was no small thing in an era when women were so systematically relegated to the margins, considered unreliable witnesses, denied political participation and banned from religious leadership, owned as property first by their fathers and then by their husbands, their main role being to provide male heirs. Isn't it just like a woman to show up with a casserole at the first hint of crisis? Or, in this case, with a bunch of grain and a heap of raisins, a couple skins of wine, a couple hundred home-baked fig cakes, and a pile of mutton, all loaded on donkeys. It was a feast far more extravagant than the bread and water with a side of meat that Nabal had denied David's men. Abigail was a very wise woman. Clandestinely, she brought the peace offering, convincing David to abandon his war plans and save himself guilt and grief. She welcomed one who was deemed an enemy, courageously and sacrificially. She met violence and vengeance with generosity and graciousness. David was smart enough to see her good sense and bless her for it. "Unless you had hurried and come to meet me," he told her, "truly by morning there would not have been left to Nabal so much as one male. Go up to your house in peace." And so Abigail did. That night, her husband Nabal died, apparently of a heart attack brought on by drunkenness and Abigail's report. So David wooed Abigail. The wise woman and the future king got married and lived happily ever after. Well, not exactly, but that's another story. So fast forward a few centuries. In October 1983, 24 peace activists gathered in Philadelphia as war raged in Nicaragua. US-backed forces known as Contras were carrying out a campaign of terror against the civilian population. The leader of a church delegation that had traveled to that embattled country 3 months before reported that while they were there, the mortar attacks, kidnappings, and massacres had temporarily ceased. What to do? The answer was obvious. If the presence of U.S. citizens was enough to offer protection to Nicaraguans, we needed to figure out how to make that presence permanent. Thus was born Witness for Peace, launched amid great doubt that we could ever find enough people to risk their lives in a war zone at their own expense. In December, I headed to Nicaragua with the first team, hearing endless stories of anguish and loss, documenting Contra atrocities, and standing in prayer with Nicaraguans at sites of attacks and massacres was life-changing for me. The war in Nicaragua eventually ended. Others erupted from Panama to Palestine, in Romania and Rwanda, in Congo, Colombia, Kosovo, and Cambodia. Dozens of wars all over the globe. On New Year's Eve of 1999, I traveled with Suzanne and Greg Walker-Wilson, Suzanne's mother Faye, and then 2-year-old Caleb to the Nevada test site to pray for a new millennium of peace as the 21st century dawned. Greg and I joined hundreds of other protesters flowing through the desert under a canopy of stars in a quiet stream of candlelight, crossing at midnight onto the site where our nation explodes nuclear bombs. I was carrying a bright red candle in a jar, bearing an image of Jesus with a burning heart and the inscription Sagrado Corazón de Jesús, Sacred Heart of Jesus. It was the only candle I could find to buy that day, when much of the world feared that all computers would crash and electricity would disappear around the world. Placed into large holding pens after our arrest, we sang for hours. And I prayed fervently that night for that child that I had just learned with delight would be welcomed into the Walker-Wilson family in a few months. Asher Walker-Wilson was born on August 26, 2000, and baptized exactly 16 years ago on World Communion Sunday in 2001. The gift I gave him that day was the Sacred Heart candle, a sign of my yearning that he would grow up in a safe and peaceful world. We pray and sing and hold candles in dark places, I wrote in a note to him that I hoped someday he would appreciate. It seems like so little, but it's the best we know to do. As I was driving home from Asher's baptism, an NPR report announced that U.S. forces, in response to the 9/11 attacks, had just launched an invasion of Afghanistan with a massive bombing strike. That war, the longest in U.S. history, continues to this day. Soon after the 9/11 attacks, an email came to me anonymously. The author spoke of taking a walk in the woods with his young daughter. She was pretending that monsters were hiding in the trees, ready to eat them. Her father asked, "And what would you do if you saw one?" "Feed them," was her reply. "Feed them?" "Yes. If we feed them, they won't want to eat us." The author then suggested that we take the billions of dollars that had just been approved for increased U.S. security and war-making, and instead, quote, spend it in every neighborhood in the world. Put the world to work growing food, healing people, restoring land and water. At the same time, a pastor in Minneapolis encouraged us to unleash our weapons of mass construction, to go about digging wells, laying roads, building hospitals and schools. "Let us scour the earth clean of terrorism," he wrote. through the merciless application of knowledge, compassion, hope, and tolerance. If we feed them, they won't want to eat us. Can you think of a better path to national security? I remembered all this when I heard that the wall the current administration wants to build on our southern border is estimated to cost $21 billion. I've been to the Mexican side of that border. I walked down the dusty, rutted roads of Nogales among dark, dilapidated shacks without running water, where children with the distended bellies of malnutrition begged for food. I sat in a tiny home constructed entirely out of worn-out car tires and heard stories about life for the workers in the maquiladoras, the U.S. production and assembly plants located on their side of the border. 1 million Mexicans are employed in more than 3,000 factories, earning on average 70 pesos per day. That's about $8.50. They endure these exploitive jobs because they feel that they have no choice. Many migrated to the border after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, went into force in 1994, opening the way for U.S. corn and other heavily subsidized staples to flood into Mexico, undercutting and destroying their livelihoods as small farmers. U.S.-based transnational corporations began taking over land that had supported families for generations, forcing more than 2 million Mexicans to leave their farms. 1/4 of the Mexican people now lack access to basic food. And increased poverty has led to the breakdown of communities and the rise of organized crime, illegal drug activity, gangs, and domestic violence. So when we ask why so many people are risking their lives, paying dangerous smugglers exorbitant fees, crossing deadly desert to get here, we have to look at ourselves, at our own country and its policies. Imagine for a moment how much better off and more secure we all would be if we took those billions of dollars it would take to build a wall and instead paid a living wage to all those workers in the maquiladoras, allowing them to live with dignity in their own country. Or better yet, how about returning the land to the farmers we've displaced? And while we're at it, maybe we should consider giving back Texas, which we stole from Mexico in 1845. With apologies to Nancy and Ken and any other Texans among us. But instead, we have an immigration crisis on our hands. I'm very grateful that we at Circle of Mercy have responded with such faithful generosity to this challenge. And I've been asked to share just a bit about the work of our immigration mission group. And I'd like to start that, first of all, by asking all the members of the group to just put up your hands. And there are some who are absent, but thank you. Our mission group is deeply involved with immigrants through our vocations or as volunteers. We're social workers and consultants, tutors of children, and drivers for doctor's appointments and court appearances. We're learning Spanish, showing up at traffic checkpoints as part of an emergency response network, working with congregations that are in discernment about whether to provide or support sanctuary for persons threatened with deportation. When it appeared last spring that a young man was going to need emergency sanctuary, members of our mission group worked with our Land of the Sky partners to quickly create a cozy and welcoming space in this church. We participated in publicity and press work that led to the release of Elmer Reynosa, who was headed for deportation, and have advocated for the young dreamers who are recipients of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Every one of us in the circle has contributed to this work through the mission grants bestowed on our mission group. Your money has sponsored a public event on immigrant detention, bought a computer for a high school student, supported the work of local immigrant organizations, and paid for translation and childcare at sanctuary and legal rights workshops. On behalf of all of us in the mission group, I want to say thank you. Thank you for partnering with us in this work, which is so critical at this moment. I've shared this story before, but I think it bears a brief retelling. It's a tale of modern day Abigails. I'm blessed to be part of Mujeres Unidas en Fe, Women United in Faith, spending 3 hours every Thursday with a group of women who are teaching me a lot more than how to improve my Spanish. When terrifying executive orders targeting undocumented persons came out of the White House soon after the last election, many immigrants understandably decided to lay low. But one of the women in our group announced, "I think the best way to keep from being sent back to Mexico is to introduce ourselves to local law enforcement. Let them see our children and get to know our families." And so we hosted Lunch with the Law. The Mujeres prepared a feast to rival Abigails. Tamales and empanadas, rice and beans, tortillas and salad, flan, and sweet dulce de leche caramel cake. The fear was evident on their faces in the presence of our 6'8" county sheriff, 9 of his deputies, and the local chief of police. But a few of them gathered their courage and spoke, voicing their terror about the possibility of being torn from their children and sent back to violence and poverty. We can't know what the future will bring, what new pressures may be in store. But that day, the law officials listened and responded in ways that made the women feel heard and safe. The sheriff pointed out that federal money isn't exactly pouring into Madison County, North Carolina, and the U.S. government has little leverage to tell him what to do. The chief of police swept his eyes around the room and declared wryly, "I guarantee to you ladies, I've put more members of my wife's family in jail than Hispanics." I've been part of a lot of failures in the past 3.5 decades since my first foray into peacemaking with Witness for Peace. Despite all our efforts, the world is a colossal mess. But this past July, Asher Walker Wilson headed to Nicaragua with a Witness for Peace team delegation. And Will Farless Yost did the same a few years back. Who could have seen that coming in Philadelphia 34 years ago? Thousands of people have traveled to Nicaragua and other Latin American countries with Witness for Peace. And back in the 1980s, the military head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff admitted, and I'm quoting him here, "We could have invaded Nicaragua if we could have gotten the damn Christians out of the way." Proud to be a damn Christian. We never know how the small seeds we plant may grow or what effect our little acts of faithfulness will have. Abigail stopped a massacre with fig cakes and a heap of raisins. And so I've added some fig Newtons to our collection of bread as a reminder on this World Communion Sunday that breaking bread together has more power than spewing threats and brandishing weapons. In the spirit of Abigail, the bold mujeres of my county, invite us to face down our fears, to reach out to our enemies, to open ourselves to being vessels of peaceful transformation. As we feast once more at this table, we are reminded that we have far more power than we could ever imagine.